On the evening of November 4th, 1998, the Baxter home on the outskirts of Charleston smelled of beef stew and warm cornbread. Mark Baxter, his face scrubbed clean of the day's coal dust, sat at the kitchen table, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the chilled autumn air outside. His daughter Amy was finishing her homework, the soft scratch of her pencil a familiar, comforting rhythm in the house. It was a simple, measured piece, built over 20 years of hard work deep within the earth. An ordinary evening, one of 1,000 just like it, seemingly unbreakable. After dinner, while his wife Sarah cleared the table, Mark pulled a crumpled work manifest from his pocket and smoothed it out under the lamplight. A small frown creased his brow. He traced a line item with a calloused finger. Sarah noticed. "Work follows you everywhere, doesn't it?" she asked gently. "It's nothing," Mark said, though his eyes lingered on the paper. "Just some paperwork that doesn't add up. Says we received a shipment of new safety harnesses last week. Funny, because we're still using the old frayed ones." He folded the paper and tucked it away. "I'll ask Murphy about it tonight. Probably just a clerical error." An hour later, he stood at the door, pulling on his heavy work boots. He kissed his daughter's forehead as she slept on the couch, then turned to Sarah. "They'll be flooding Blackwood for good in a few weeks," he said, more to himself than to her. "This old place has seen its last days." Sarah simply nodded and handed him his lunch pail. "Be careful," she whispered. He gave her a steady, reassuring smile. "Always am. See you in the morning." He didn't know that for him, morning would never come. The countdown had begun, measured not in hours, but in the slow, inexorable rise of cold water in a forgotten pit. John Murphy was more than a mine foreman. He was an institution at the Blackwood Creek Colliery. As the union chapter president, his voice carried the weight of authority and trust. He was a man who could calm a heated contract dispute with a steady gaze and a few well-chosen words, a charismatic leader who fought for better pay and safer conditions. In archival interviews from 1998, fellow miners describe him as the last honest man in the coal business, a protector of the working man. To the Baxter family, he was a friend, a man who had shared a beer with Mark in their kitchen on more than one occasion. This public persona, however, was a meticulously crafted facade. The guardian of the miners' pension fund was systematically bleeding it dry. Forensic accounting conducted decades later would uncover a network of shell corporations used to bill the mine for phantom safety equipment. Invoices were paid for respirator filters, steel-toed boots, and emergency oxygen tanks that never arrived. The money, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars, was funneled into offshore accounts. John Murphy was building a comfortable retirement on the future security he claimed to protect. The foundation of this criminal enterprise was the implicit trust of the men around him. But Mark Baxter was different. He didn't operate on trust alone. He operated on ledgers, manifests, and the physical reality of the equipment he used every day. His question about the missing safety harnesses, posed casually to Murphy a day earlier, was not born of suspicion, but of simple, methodical diligence. To Murphy, however, it was the sound of a key turning in a lock he had spent years building. He knew Baxter's nature. The man was a bloodhound for details. An unanswered question about harnesses would lead to questions about invoices, then to shipping records, and then to the shell companies. The entire fraud, so close to being permanently submerged with the closure of the mine, was suddenly at risk of being exposed by one quiet, honest man. In the days leading up to November 4th, Murphy displayed no outward signs of panic. His actions were precise and calculated. He reviewed the final decommissioning schedule, noting the exact date the pumps that kept the main quarry pit dry were to be shut down. He accessed the personnel file of Dale Jennings, a young mechanic struggling with debt, a man whose loyalty could be bought. Murphy was seen by everyone as the man working to secure the miner's legacy as Blackwood Creek prepared to close. In reality, He was meticulously planning to ensure one of those miners would be buried with it. He was not just a thief. He was an architect of silence. At approximately 2300 hours, John Murphy's voice crackled over Mark Baxter's radio. The request was routine, almost mundane. A final hydraulics check was needed on the Titan, the colossal stripping shovel parked at the lowest level of the quarry. With the decommissioning audit imminent, Murphy explained, every piece of heavy machinery needed a final sign-off. For a man like Baxter, a request to do a job by the book was not a request, but an order. He drove his utility vehicle down the winding ramp into the vast, echoing darkness of the pit. The sequence of events that followed was reconstructed 24 years later from a single confession. Baxter climbed the steel ladder into the Titan's operator cabin. A moment later, the heavy door slammed shut, the sound of its latch echoing off the quarry walls. From the immense shadow cast by the machine's boom, Dale Jennings emerged, wheeling a portable Lincoln welder. He had been told this was just to scare Baxter, to stop him from asking questions. He was assured Mark would be let out before the morning shift. The primary evidence of the crime was not visual, but auditory. Had anyone been present in the pit that night, they would have heard the sudden, violent hum of the welder striking an arc. A brilliant blue-white light would have momentarily illuminated the cabin's exterior, tracing a path around the door's frame. This sound was punctuated by another, more desperate one, the dull, percussive thud of a heavy work boot kicking against steel from the inside. 1, 2, 3 kicks. Then nothing. The sound was swallowed by the high-pitched crackle of the welding torch. Jennings was not a master craftsman. The weld he laid down was thick, ugly, and brutally effective. A jagged scar of molten metal, cooling in the frigid night air, permanently fused the door to its frame. The process took less than 10 minutes. The blue light died, plunging the machine back into darkness. An absolute silence fell over the quarry floor. The two men did not linger. They packed the equipment and walked away, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Left behind, the Titan sat inert, a mountain of dark steel. Deep in the mine, a series of submersible pumps, the mechanical heartbeat of Blackwood Creek, continued their steady work, holding back the groundwater. Their rhythm was a temporary reprieve. A clock ticking down. John Murphy returned to the foreman's office. He poured himself a cup of coffee and made an entry in the nightly log, noting a minor electrical fault in a conveyor belt. He was methodical, unhurried. He was not just a killer, he was an administrator, closing out a liability. The cabin of the Titan, once a symbol of industrial power, had become a steel sarcophagus, waiting patiently for the rising tide. When Mark Baxter failed to return home, the initial response was managed confusion. The West Virginia State Police arrived at Blackwood Creek Colliery to find a sprawling industrial labyrinth on the brink of permanent shutdown. Baxter's truck was in its designated spot, and his uneaten lunch was found on a bench in the break room. The first 48 hours were a frantic search, with teams of miners and officers combing the accessible tunnels and surface areas, their headlamps cutting futile beams through the oppressive dust and gloom. John Murphy was the calm center of this storm. He presented himself to the lead investigator as a pillar of support and a vital source of information. He unrolled blueprints, directed search parties to high-risk areas, and expressed profound, believable grief. It was during his second interview, conducted in the foreman's office, that he expertly manipulated the course of the investigation. With a heavy sigh, he reluctantly mentioned that Mark Baxter, while a good man, had a serious ongoing feud with another miner over a property line dispute. He recounted how the argument had nearly come to blows just a month prior. This piece of information was a godsend to the overwhelmed investigators. It offered a tangible human motive in a place where 1,000 forms of accidental death were possible. Murphy then added the crucial detail. The other miner had abruptly quit his job and left West Virginia just a week after Baxter vanished. He had a history of a bad temper, and was known to hold a grudge. The focus of the investigation immediately pivoted. Resources were diverted to tracking this new, promising suspect, a man who seemed to have fled the state in the wake of a potential crime. The systemic failure was almost inevitable. The police were operating under extreme pressure. The mining company had a multi-million-dollar decommissioning schedule to maintain, and the pumps keeping the main quarry from flooding were set to be shut down in a matter of days. Every hour spent searching the mine was an hour the investigation was falling behind on its human lead. The search of the colliery became a perfunctory exercise, its goal shifting from finding a crime scene to recovering a body before the site was lost forever. When the search yielded nothing, and with the fugitive miner still unaccounted for, the official narrative solidified. Mark Baxter had tragically fallen victim to the inherent dangers of his profession. He likely stumbled into an unmapped shaft or was buried in a small, unrecorded rockfall. His body was declared lost, swallowed by the very earth he had spent his life excavating. The official file was closed, the cause of disappearance listed as a probable industrial accident. As the case was being archived, the pumps at Blackwood Creek were finally switched off. The water began to rise. The Blackwood Creek colliery did not die quietly. It drowned. Over the course of a year, the main quarry pit filled with groundwater, transforming into a vast, unnervingly still lake. The water, tainted by decades of mineral and chemical runoff, took on a permanent, rust-colored hue. Fences went up, bearing stark warnings against trespassing. The site became a scar on the landscape, a place local parents used to frighten their children. Stories were told of a ghost mine haunted by the spirits of men lost to its depths, a convenient fiction that obscured the singular specific horror it concealed. Beneath 50 feet of acidic water, the Titan sat in absolute darkness, its steel frame slowly surrendering to decay, a silent, unseen tombstone. In Charleston, John Murphy lived a life of quiet dignity. The embezzled funds, laundered through the mine's final chaotic months, provided a comfortable retirement. He became a fixture in his community, a respected elder who donated generously to the local church and the miners' relief fund. He was known as a man who had given his life and his lungs to the coal industry, a fact made tragically visible by the ever-present oxygen tank that followed him in his later years. He was seen as a survivor, a relic of a tougher, more honorable era. His health declined steadily from the black lung disease that was endemic to his generation of miners. It was a slow, creeping affliction, a darkness filling his lungs, a poetic injustice no one could appreciate. He watched his grandchildren grow up, attended summer barbecues, and recounted stories of his time at Blackwood Creek, always speaking of Mark Baxter with a solemn, sorrowful respect. He played the part of a grieving friend flawlessly for over 2 decades. The contrast between the two men's fates was absolute. One was memorialized by a name on a list of industrial accidents, his family left with a permanent, aching void. The other was celebrated as a patriarch, his life built upon the very secret that had destroyed the other. For 24 years, the truth lay dormant, sealed not just by a bead of weld, but by the crushing weight of water, time, and a community's misplaced trust. Justice was not just blind, it was submerged. For 24 years, the secret of Blackwood Creek was protected by chemistry and gravity. Then, in the summer of 2022, politics intervened. New state environmental legislation mandated the cleanup of abandoned industrial sites, and funds were appropriated for the reclamation of the old colliery. The project was clinical, not archaeological. Engineers and environmental scientists arrived with industrial-grade pumps, their objective simply to drain the toxic lake, treat the water, and begin the long process of restoring the land. No one was looking for a body. The process was slow, taking several weeks. As the rust-colored water receded inch by painstaking inch, a shape began to emerge from the murky depths. First, the top of a massive boom, then a towering gantry. Finally, the monolithic form of the Marion 6360 stripping shovel, the Titan, revealed itself. It was a rust-eaten leviathan, a relic from another age, standing silently on the quarry floor. It was seen as a curiosity, a challenge for the demolition crews. That changed when a site surveyor, tasked with assessing the machine for salvage, peered through the grimy window of the operator's cabin. Inside, tangled in the control levers, were the skeletal remains of a man. The discovery immediately halted the reclamation project and triggered a full-scale forensic investigation. The initial assumption was that this was the body of Mark Baxter, finally found. But it was a secondary discovery made by the forensics team that transformed the scene from a tragic accident into something far more sinister. The heavy steel door of the cabin had not been latched or jammed. It had been welded shut from the outside. A thick, crude, brutal scar of fused metal ran the entire perimeter of the doorframe. Mark Baxter had not been trapped. He had been entombed. The new findings landed in a thick, dust-covered file on the desk of Detective Peter Kowalski of the Charleston Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Kowalski, now a veteran investigator, had been a rookie patrolman in 1998. He vaguely remembered the faded missing person flyers for Mark Baxter that had been taped to storefront windows all over town. Now, 24 years later, a routine environmental cleanup had turned a forgotten tragedy into an active homicide. For Kowalski, the case was no longer a historical footnote. It was a ghost from his own past, demanding justice. Detective Peter Kowalski did not see the Blackwood Creek file as a cold case. For him, it was a brand new homicide, the crime scene preserved underwater for 24 years. The original investigation's conclusion of accidental death was discarded in the first 5 minutes. The weld on the Titan's cabin door was not evidence of an accident. It was a signature. It was the centerpiece of a meticulously planned execution. Kowalski's approach was not to re-examine the old theory, but to dissect the anatomy of the lie that had created it. His first step was to treat the welded door as the murder weapon. He sent detailed photographs and metal scrapings to the state's forensic metallurgy lab. The report that came back was incredibly specific. The analysts identified the distinct chemical composition of a Lincoln Electric Fleet Weld 5P+ welding rod, a common type used for high-pressure pipe welding. More importantly, they analyzed the weld signature, the unique ripples and heat patterns left in the steel, and determined it was created by a specific model of industrial welder, powered by a diesel generator. It was the exact equipment listed in the 1998 inventory logs for the Blackwood Creek on-site workshop. The murder was an inside job, carried out with the mine's own tools. This led Kowalski deep into the case archives, into boxes of dusty, forgotten paperwork. He found the workshop equipment sign-out log for November of 1998. The page for the night Mark Baxter disappeared was marred by a large, dark smudge, rendering most of it illegible. It had been noted as simple water damage in the original report. But under an ultraviolet light source in the modern forensics lab, the iron in the old ink revealed what the smudge was meant to hide. 2 partial signatures materialized from the faded page. The first, authorizing the use of the equipment, was clearly legible: John Murphy. The second, signing for a portable welder, was a scrawl: D. Jennings. With those 2 names, Kowalski reread the entire original file. John Murphy was no longer the helpful, grieving foreman. He was the man who had authorized the use of the murder weapon on the night of the murder. His confident testimony about a feud between Baxter and another miner now read like a masterful piece of misdirection, a deliberately planted false lead that had successfully diverted the entire 1998 investigation. Kowalski pulled the old interview transcripts with Sarah Baxter. In her initial statement, she had mentioned Mark was concerned about some missing safety harnesses and was going to ask Murphy about it. Suddenly, All the pieces that had been ignored or misinterpreted, the casual workplace question, the conveniently smudged logbook, the perfectly timed false lead, snapped together into a single, terrifying picture of premeditated murder. Detective Kowalski's first interviews with the now 72-year-old John Murphy were exercises in futility. Murphy sat in the living room of his pristine suburban home, the gentle hiss of his oxygen concentrator a constant rhythmic counterpoint to his calm, measured denials. He presented himself as a frail old man, his memory eroded by time and illness, shocked and saddened that anyone could suspect him of such a thing. He was polite, cooperative, and utterly impenetrable. Kowalski knew he was facing a wall of practiced deceit, built brick by brick over a quarter of a century. A direct assault would never breach it. So Kowalski turned his attention to the second name from the smudged logbook. He found Dale "Rusty" Jennings working at a rundown garage on the industrial outskirts of the city. The place smelled of old oil and stale regret. Rusty was a ghost of a man, his face a roadmap of hard living, his hands permanently stained with grease. He was the antithesis of Murphy's comfortable retirement, a man visibly consumed by the secret he was forced to keep. Kowalski didn't bring him in for a formal interrogation. He met him in the garage's cluttered office after hours. He didn't read him his rights or start with a barrage of questions. Instead, he sat down at the small, greasy table and slid a single, high-resolution crime scene photograph across its surface. It was a stark, clinical image of the Titan's cabin, Mark Baxter's skeleton, still clad in the remnants of his work clothes, hopelessly entangled in the excavator's control levers. The claustrophobic intimacy of the welded tomb was captured in brutal detail. Kowalski let the silence stretch, allowing the image to do its work. Then, in a low, even voice, he spoke. "You didn't just seal a door, Dale, you sealed a tomb. Murphy is dying and he's going to let you take the fall alone." That single statement, combined with the visceral visual proof of his actions, shattered Rusty Jennings's resolve. The guilt he had carried for 24 years erupted. In a rambling, tearful confession that lasted for more than 2 hours, he recounted every detail of that night. Murphy's persuasion, the lie that it was just a scare tactic, the sound of Baxter kicking the door, and the crippling, lifelong burden of the truth. The confession was the final, irrefutable piece of the mosaic. John Murphy was brought in for a final interview. He entered the room with the same air of weary indignation. Kowalski let him settle, the hiss of his portable oxygen tank filling the quiet room. The detective didn't present maps or lab reports. He simply looked the old man in the eye and said, "Dale Jennings gave a full confession." For the first time, John Murphy's mask of composure cracked. His face went pale, a sudden, sharp intake of breath fighting the rhythm of his machine. The wall he had so carefully maintained for 2.5 decades did not crumble with a roar, but with a profound, suffocating silence. It was the silence of a man who had finally been excavated. The trial of John Murphy was a spectacle of disbelief for the Charleston community. The man they had known for decades as a Union stalwart and respected retiree now sat at the defendant's table, a frail figure tethered to an oxygen tank, accused of a crime of unimaginable cruelty. Throughout the proceedings, he remained a statue of denial, his gaze fixed forward, offering no reaction as the prosecution laid out the architecture of his greed and deception. The courtroom was filled with whispers, the collective shock of a community forced to confront the truth about the man they thought they knew. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the testimony of Dale "Rusty" Jennings. On the witness stand, he was a broken man, his voice often cracking as he recounted the events of that November night 24 years earlier. He did not spare himself, detailing his own cowardice and the crushing weight of the secret he had carried. His raw, tearful confession held the courtroom captive, painting a vivid picture of Mark Baxter's final moments, a story not of a mine collapse, but of a calculated, cold-blooded murder. Across the room, John Murphy listened without a flicker of emotion, his silence a final chilling testament to his lack of remorse. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The pronouncement was met not with an outburst, but with a profound, heavy silence. John Murphy simply closed his eyes for a moment, a barely perceptible nod, his only acknowledgement of the judgment. He was a man who had outrun the truth for nearly a quarter of a century, only to be caught a few short steps from the finish line of a natural death. For Sarah and Amy Baxter, who sat in the front row every single day of the trial, the verdict was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of bitter relief, of profound and painful vindication. The truth they had always felt in their bones was now a matter of public record. Nothing could fill the aching void left by Mark's absence, but the verdict finally gave a name to their loss. He had not been a victim of the mountain, but of a man he called a friend. Justice, born from the rusted ashes of the Titan, had finally been served. John Murphy's final days were not long. Just 3 months after the verdict, he died of respiratory failure in a prison hospital, his lungs finally surrendering to the same coal dust that had once fueled his prosperity. To the very end, he maintained his silence, never offering an apology or an explanation, taking the full weight of his motives with him to the grave. Dale Jennings received a reduced sentence of manslaughter for his testimony and was released on parole after serving 7 years. The Titan, too massive to be easily dismantled, became an object of local legacy. Funded by the Baxter family, a historical society arranged for the colossal machine to be moved to a small memorial park overlooking the now reclaimed mine site. It stands there today, a silent, rusting monument to a dark chapter in the town's history. The welded cabin door, with its jagged, brutal scar of metal, was carefully removed. It is now held as a permanent exhibit at the West Virginia State Crime Lab Museum, a testament to a secret kept and a life stolen. The story of Mark Baxter is a reminder that the most impenetrable vault is not made of steel, but of time, and that a lie, when protected by a community's trust, can hold for generations. But secrets buried deep within the earth do not vanish. They merely wait, because the earth, in its own slow and patient time, always gives up its dead. And the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, will eventually find its way to the surface.